Hello, my name is Elizabeth, and today I'm going to be discussing poetics, specifically mistakes that I see made by newer poets. This video is going to be addressing higher order concerns for writing poetry, meaning if you're struggling with these components of writing, it'll have a drastic impact on the quality of your poetry. I just want to make a note quickly before we start that everyone starts with different strengths and weaknesses with writing, and that if there's something that you're struggling with, you shouldn't see it as something you should be embarrassed about. There's always a possibility of making improvements in order to correct those mistakes. So with that said, here are 5 mistakes that I see beginner writers make. Mistake number 1, no interpretive space. Poetry, like any other artistic medium, requires space for the interpreter to come to their own conclusions. What you choose to write about is vitally important. How you choose to say it matters, but sometimes how you choose not to say something can have an even greater impact. With poetry, you need space in order to create an exacting portrait of what you're trying to express. And space is something that you have to consider and balance throughout the entirety of your work. If you're too abstract or vague with language, then your poem will be bland and it won't have the capacity to connect with the individual on an intimate level. If you're too specific or heavy-handed, you're leaving no room for interpretation. This in turn will destroy any potential rapport that you might be able to develop with the interpreter. So how can you incorporate more space into your poetry? First, you need to trust that your readers understand subtlety. It's not that you're trying to make riddles. With tone, imagery, momentum, form, all of the choices that you make in these aspects of writing all work together in order to create meaning. The other really great way to incorporate more space into your poetry is to look at the gaps of association between phrases or lines in your poetry. When you're setting up a dramatic situation for your poem, you have to consider what details that you ought to include and what details are really unnecessary. So in order to incorporate more interpretive space into your poetry in this way, you can ask yourself the following. What is the elapsed duration of time that my poem will observe? If I were to take out certain phrases or details, would it better focus the meaning of my poem's subject matter? Am I giving the reader enough substance and space for them to experience the poem? Mistake number 2, no imagery, just feelings and abstract concepts. Really, this is creative writing 101, the classic show, don't tell. And this is probably the greatest offense of commercial poetry today. Even when you're dealing with abstract concepts or elusive aspects of the human condition, you still need to figure out a way to ground that in the physical world. For instance, say you have an object. You should consider how is the speaker observing that part of their environment, and in what manner are they describing it? And does that reflect their internal world at all? So when you are choosing to incorporate sensory details, you really do need to be selective in choosing what is actually relevant to the points or concepts that you're trying to develop. To go further, you could also consider ways to incorporate symbolism into your work. So symbolism is when we take the material to represent more intricate concepts or ideas. So symbolism can be found in objects, people, places, times, events, and more. Additionally, I just want to clarify, it's never that we're trying to conceal what we're talking about. It's more so that we're trying to develop a more artful and interesting means of expressing our point. Another thing to be able to further show rather than tell is to consider word choice or diction. And diction is a really great way to establish the mood or the feeling of your piece. So language always has an emotional weight to it, and that's through its just everyday use. There's a lot of contextual kind of meaning that can't help but be associated with certain words through the history of its use. I think that that's a really beautiful and amazing thing, personally. That's one of the things that I really love about language, is that it can be so specific. So that is something that you have to be careful about. So for instance, say that you were writing a poem and you had the word helpless describing a person, but you don't quite feel like it's the strongest or the best word that you can use in the context of your line. Say you're having trouble thinking of other words that you could use. Maybe you're trying to choose between the words uncovered or unguarded. How would you decide in that context which word to use? What you need to do is really consider what it is that your poem is trying to say in its totality. And you need to select the word that will best help you communicate what it is that the deeper points of your poetry is trying to suggest to the reader. So if you were to choose the word unguarded, so unguarded suggests that there is a potential danger present as well as a state of personal lack. However, uncovered really only describes the condition, and it doesn't have as much of a emotional charge to it. It would, in my opinion, kind of provide a more neutral kind of explanation of the condition. You might find that neither of the words really work and that you need to select a different word entirely, but that's sort of the thinking that you need to go through when you're trying to be more specific or you're trying to strengthen the meaning of your verse. So anytime that you're making these word exchanges, you need to consider the way that the poem sounds, the tone that it provides, and then also the rhythm. So this actually brings us to our next mistake. Alright, so mistake number 3 is lacking cohesion. I've already touched on this point a few times already, but what we mean when we're talking about cohesion is just the way in which the totality of the poem is sort of uniformed and contained. So regarding cohesion with writing, everything that you include in your poem needs to reflect back to the themes or ideas that you want to fully develop, and everything that you include in the poem needs to collectively communicate this deeper resonance of the subject matter. Some questions to consider regarding this would be, how are the images I used related to one another? Is the tone consistent? Are there any moments that create undesired tension or confusion? Is my poem trying to embody a greater subject matter than what the length or form can reasonably handle? And when we understand how cohesion is built with poetry, we can then start to play with adding more tension and creating meaning in that way with our poems. So certainly we want to be able to surprise the reader, but if we're not focused enough with our expressions, it inhibits the deeper dimensions of our writing. That brings us to mistake number 4, shameless cliché. Again, this seems like a very obvious thing that we should all aim to avoid, but it is really common. You should never use adages in your poetry. The whole point of poetry is to craft a new or interesting manner of viewing the world around us. Aside from not using cliche adages or phrases, you also need to consider the topics that you choose to write about and how you choose to explore them. So there are topics that have been written about since the beginning of poetry. Things like love. Love has been written about extensively, and I think that you're gonna be hard pressed to find someone making an earnest love poem in a way that is not cringe, okay? Unless you have a really interesting twist on it, you're going to have a very difficult time. Okay, say there's a really broad subject that you want to write about. You really need to focus in. You're not going to be addressing the totality of the subject of, say, like love or loss. You're going to be narrowing in on a very specific aspect of it. It's about refining the observation and the experience of the individual regarding certain topics. Ultimately, you need to determine what perspectives you have on the topic, and they need to be something that you haven't seen expressed yet through other mediums. Or maybe you have seen it expressed partially, say in a movie or in a painting. These feelings that arise in you, you need to translate that into language. And I think that's more of what the process of poetry is. It's almost like translating your experience into language and translating the embodiment and the totality of your being into language. The topic of where ideas come from for each individual is going to be radically different, and how concepts or creativity manifests and is translated into the world is going to be different for every person. But there may be overlap. So it can come down to technique, it can come down to your daily practice, taking in new experiences and really doing self-reflection and not taking anything for granted regarding how you view the world. You really do need to be an active participant in your daily experience. Mistake number 5 is not having a purpose or being pretentious. So if you write only based on aesthetics, or you make choices without considering how all of the elements relate to one another, you might be guilty of this. When you just focus on sound, you're able to create some really interesting things, but in a lot of cases, it's going to be lacking in the dimension of content, meaning actually having a driving aim or being able to communicate one unified point for the piece. In order to create something more than what would be considered a linguistic exercise, you need to take into account all of the different elements when you're writing and crafting a poem. There is a lot to poetry, and you have to think about form, structure, tone, style, tension, dramatic setting, allegory, metaphor, and all of these elements are used in relation to one another. They ultimately create the meaning of your poem in one unified expression. It's really good to recognize that you don't have to have it all figured out in the beginning. In a lot of cases, it's something that evolves or develops over the course of the writing process. So personally, I think that the first draft for a poem should be written based on instinct. In cases like that, the circumstance would be perhaps you have a line or a feeling that arises in you, and you find a pen and paper quickly, or you go to the computer and you start writing, and you just write what comes to you and what seems like all of the necessary pieces. Obviously, the more experience you have in doing this, you're going to naturally start thinking of more of the components of sound or form, or having more of an understanding of how and when to incorporate certain images in the first run. In a lot of cases, the first draft, it won't exercise all of the qualities that it could fully embody. And that's something that you work on through the writing process then, when you go over and you start kind of seeing what the strengths of the poem are and what the weaknesses are. So after the first draft, then you go back and you are more procedural with how you're looking at the poem. You do have to be careful because you don't want to overwork something too much where it becomes really sterile. With the writing process, you want to maintain the integrity of the energy, because will be some mood that is established in that first draft. There's some quality of authenticity that exists and lives in the first draft, but you need to use discernment and determine what elements and what phrases or what lines stay and strengthen the intention of the poem, and what doesn't, and what detracts and confuses what it is that the point of the poem is. Continuing on, when you're writing a first draft of a poem, sometimes you don't know what it is that the purpose of the poem is. You just have this emotion and you have these images and this feeling, and so it's when you see it on a page you kind of determine what are the themes that seem to be kind of like sticking through the surface. What is the subtext of what's there? And it's about kind of shaping and carving a way to a more recognizable state of what permeates the page, I guess, or the consciousness. So yeah, if you're just writing off the top of your head and you're just writing what sounds good, it's going to end up lacking a deeper concepts, just because all of the work that goes into a poem, it can't, most of the time. There are times when you love a poem, it's just great the way it is, but largely that won't be the case. There is a lot of kind of consideration that has to go into the different aspects of it. So what are some questions that you can ask yourself to prevent yourself from being aimless with your writing and making sure that you maintain a clear vision? Some things that you want to ask yourself would be the following. How many lines of verse does it take to build a rapport with the reader and establish the mood? What kind of imagery, language, and metaphor can I craft that further extends the meaning of the writing's intent? Am I providing enough interpretive space for the reader to draw their own conclusions? All of the points that I previously touched on actually do also apply to this point. So considering space, considering the tone and the imagery, being cohesive, and being original, having a driven focus. That's like the soul of your poem, is what it's trying to communicate, the essence of the poem. And all of this works together to establish a very defined intent and a defined meaning. You really do have to carve out the intention of your poem, otherwise you won't be able to make a cohesive thing. The choices that you make, you won't really have a clear direction, and so you won't be able to determine what will be the best choice. Of course, this is all from the perspective of a very cerebral kind of attitude regarding the writing of poetry. I do personally feel as though there is a very large aspect of poetry writing that is intuitive. It is based on instinct. It's something that you feel out. It's not always a cerebral activity. It's something that's rooted somewhere else. It's not just the mind. As I said before, certainly the meaning of the poem will evolve over the writing process. Sometimes you'll have ideas that you're really excited about, but when you start looking over the full context of the poem, you might find that it doesn't really work. So you'll have to remove things, or you'll have to really make tough decisions about the poem. But all of it is for the betterment of the artistic vision, the goal, or it's all for the exploration of your poetic expression. So those were the 5 writing mistakes that I see a lot of beginner poets make. In regards to how we improve as writers and artists, it takes time to be able to get to a point where you're actually satisfied with what you're making. And there is a lot of discipline and there's a lot of time and effort that goes into making poetry and making art. And not everything that you make is going to be good. As long as you're putting in the work and you're making earnest efforts to try and push yourself and to challenge yourself to make something that's a little bit more complex each time, or working on certain aspects each time, you're going to grow and you're going to have a better ability to utilize different elements and aspects of poetry. So there's nothing to feel embarrassed about if you're struggling with any of these mistakes, if it's something that you find to be difficult. The bottom line is that we need to be open to criticism. We need to be open to the idea that we might be wrong, because then it enables us to be able to make room to see what we need to change or what needs to be different about the way we look at the world or the way that we process our perception, you know? If there's anything that you need me to clarify, or if there's anything that you want me to go more in depth about, just let me know, and I'll either respond in just a comment or I might make a video about it if I feel like I have enough to say about the topic. If you'd like to support my work, you can feel free to subscribe. You can also purchase my poetry chapbook if you'd like. I do have a folk album that I released actually this month, and you can listen to that on YouTube or you can listen to it on Bandcamp, and you can purchase it on Bandcamp if you're interested. So other than that, yeah, that's really it. Okay, thank you, goodbye, see ya.